All right, we are continuing on in our journey through 1 Corinthians this week. There is so much to cover, and I'm trying to make these videos not 3 hours long, so I'm just going to jump straight in. We already talked last week. The church in Corinth is a church that was planted by Paul over a year and a half. It is a network of house churches all over this predominantly Gentile, predominantly pagan town in the Roman Empire called Corinth. Now, because these people have grown up in the culture of ancient Roman paganism for years and years and years, they have learned so many wildly destructive mindsets and patterns that they have had a very hard time getting out of. And as a result, they have taken so many of the true things that Paul has said, distorted them, taken them totally out of context, and turned them into pretenses to live in wildly unhealthy, wildly ungodly ways that not only stifle their own spiritual growth because sin and wickedness has been reigning supreme in their churches, but also actively sabotage their mission in Corinth because the pagans in the city of Corinth around them have no reason to take them seriously or believe that they truly know the true God when they are living in these wildly wicked and idolatrous and unjust ways. Last week, we laid out some of the problems that Paul is writing to address. We tackled them in order of the letter, and we're going to do the same thing. We talked about the first three problems last week. Today, we are going to talk about the fourth, fifth, and sixth problem, but there is a ton going on in there as we do that. So I'm going to jump straight in now. Problem number 4 is that the Corinthian churches were having these intense, vicious, divisive arguments about whether or not you could eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols. They were arguing over whether or not it was okay as a follower of Jesus to eat meat from animals that were sacrificed in pagan rituals, pagan worship services to the pagan gods that the pagans in Corinth worshipped. So after those sacrifices would be made during those pagan rituals, they would sell the sacrificial meat in the marketplace the next day. That sacrificial meat was usually much cheaper than other meat, and as a result, a lot of people gravitated towards buying that meat from the animals sacrificed to false gods. For some people, they had no issue with this, but for other people in the Corinthian church, they saw that as blasphemous. They saw that as disrespectful to the Lord. They saw that as maybe even opening yourself up to a cult infiltration or something like that by playing around with pagan sacrificial items. So they saw buying and eating the sacrificial idol meat as being similar to messing around with Ouija boards or tarot cards or something else along those lines today. And there's this just intense divisive argument between them because on the one hand, you have people who are really bothered by it. Maybe they've just recently come to faith. They've just recently become Christians, or maybe they are some of the relatively few Jewish Christians in the church in Corinth, and they're really bothered by it. But at the same time, you have other people, and just like with all of the earlier issues, they are inflated with pride. They are filled up with this self-exaltation, this superiority complex. They see themselves as superior to the others in the church, more mature than the others in the church, more intelligent than the others in the church, more more spiritual than the others in the church, whatever it is, they say, okay, yeah, look, you have a problem with eating idol meat because you don't know anything, because you're immature, because you're weak in the faith, but I'm strong in the faith, and so I know that this idol meat can't hurt me. Basically what they're saying is, the fact that this bothers you doesn't matter, because it doesn't bother me. They're saying, I want to buy this affordable meat, and my desire for this affordable meat is more important than your need. And so Paul writes to them and he says, listen, this entire disagreement, this entire battle is rooted once again in your pride. Your prideful unwillingness to meet each other where you are. You, the people who want to eat the idol meat, you need to meet the people who are offended where they are. And you, the people who are offended, you need to meet the people who eat the idol meat where they are. You need to learn not to try to force yourself on each other, but to just let the other be. And he lays out a pretty detailed argument for why that is. First things first, he says, listen, meat sacrificed to idols is not dangerous. Meat sacrificed to idols cannot harm you. Meat sacrificed to idols is not going to curse you. Meat sacrificed to idols is not going to in some way put you in the power of the idols it was sacrificed to. Why is that? It's because the idols are not real gods. The idols have no real power. The idols do not have genuine authority or lordship or power over you. As a follower of Christ, you belong to the true God. You are under the protection of the true God. You are in the hand of the true God. Those idols can't do anything to you unless God allows it, and God is not going to allow anything to happen. Those idols are nothing. They're imaginary. It says those idols may be representative of demons or something along those lines, but once again, those demons cannot hurt you. They have no power over you. You are safely in the hands of the good shepherd. He says, don't be superstitious. So, first, he says, to the people who are viciously, no compromise, just no holds barred campaigning, saying, hey, you have to stop eating that meat that was sacrificed to idols. He says to them, hey, you, stop being superstitious. Chill out. It is fine. It is no big deal. Stop making a big deal out of it. Stop worrying about it. You have nothing to be afraid of. You don't have to eat the idol meat yourself if it makes you uncomfortable, but it's fine. Those idols are not gods. They have no power over you. But then he turns to the other group. He turns to that group who said, I don't care what you think. I don't care how you feel. I don't care what you need. I want to eat this cheap meat. And I'm going to eat it whenever I want, wherever I want, however I want. And you can't do anything about it because I am strong in the faith. You're just weak in the faith. Your problem is that you're just not as mature or smart as me. To those people who pridefully refuse to accommodate their offended brothers and sisters, who refuse to accommodate their brothers and sisters who are genuinely, disturbed in their spirit by this, who just pridefully say, hey, you don't matter. He says to them, look, The pagans in Corinth do not know that those idols aren't real. When they see you eating meat sacrificed to idols, they are going to think you are worshiping those idols. And in the same way, brand new Christians just coming out of paganism, they don't know that those idols aren't real and have no power. And so if they are just coming out of a life of being indoctrinated into the beliefs and rituals and lifestyles of paganism, seeing you eat meat sacrificed to pagan idols is going to confuse them at best, and it might even tempt them. It might tempt them back into idolatry, back towards paganism. It might actually draw them away from the truth. And therefore, Paul says, out of love for them, that is love for two types of people: love for the pagans outside the church, and love for the brand new believers who just came out of paganism inside the church. You should not eat meat sacrificed to idols in front of them. You can eat it on your own. You can eat it at home. You can eat it with other people who understand that those idols are powerless and that you don't need to be afraid of them. But whenever you are with either a pagan or a brand new believer who doesn't get it yet, just meet them where they are. Get over yourself. Your desire for this meat is not as important as their need not to be confused and not to be tempted. He says, me and the rest of the apostles have modeled this for you. We've modeled this mindset for you. The mindset you need to take up is a mindset that says, others are more important than me. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to put other people in front of yourself? Again and again, Paul clearly images this and defines this for us. It does not mean that you think other people's needs are more important than your needs. And it definitely doesn't mean you think other people's wants are more important than your needs. What it means to put other people before yourself is that you put their needs ahead of your wants. That is what it means to put others above yourself. Put their needs ahead of your wants, their necessities ahead of your luxuries. And so the example that he uses is, look, me and the rest of the apostles, we are entitled to a living wage for the work we do on behalf of the churches. The ox is worthy of its grain. The worker is worthy of its wages. And yet, most of the churches are tiny and extremely poor, and we don't want to burden the tiny, poor house churches. Therefore, I work as a tent maker to support myself as much as I can. The other apostles worked their own jobs to support themselves as much as they can. Jesus worked as a carpenter to support himself as much as he could, to minimize the burden that it places on the churches. I am not taking full advantage of my right to a living wage for the work I do on your behalf in order to meet you where you are. In the same way, me and the rest of the apostles, we bend over backwards to accommodate Jews when we're with them. We don't eat things that are restricted according to the dietary laws of Moses when we are with Jews, because we don't want to needlessly offend them and disturb their spirits. When we are with Gentiles, we are mindful and sensitive to cultural issues that come with whatever their Gentile culture is, so that we don't needlessly offend them or disturb their spirits. We deny ourselves all kinds of things whenever it is necessary for the benefit of others. We put your needs ahead of our wants, your necessities ahead of our luxuries. And you should do the same exact thing with idol meat. Do not needlessly confuse or tempt or offend your brothers and sisters in the church by eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols in front of them. It is that simple. You have a sinful pride that is unwillingness to meet other people where they are, but the gospel should humble you and fill you with this mindset that says, I am going to do everything I reasonably can to meet other people where they are. That is problem number 4. Here is problem number 5. Paul is writing this letter to the Corinthian churches because their worship gatherings have become self-centered instead of God-centered. They have been living a self-centered life instead of a God-centered life, a man-centered life instead of a God-centered life, and that has spilled over into the way that they do their worship services. This is going to be the longest part of the video because Paul lists 4 different ways that their worship services have become self-centered, not God-centered. I'm just going to make my way through the list as clearly and quickly as I can. The first way they've made their worship services self-centered is that they have abandoned all forms of God-given, God-created, beautifully designed, purposefully woven in gender distinctions, gender roles. Paul says gender roles are good. Gender roles are God-given. Gender distinctions are beautiful. Gender distinctions were woven into the fabric of creation on purpose by God Himself in the beginning. And yet, the Corinthians have rejected these gender distinctions. They've rejected these gender roles. They have rejected the reality of differences between men and women, and they have rejected the cultural markers that the ancient Roman culture used to affirm and acknowledge those gender distinctions. What am I talking about? Here's what I'm talking about. In the ancient Roman world, they believed that short hair was honorable for men, that if you were a man and you had short hair, that symbolized you had a respect for authority, you had a respect for the social order, you had a respect for, societal structures and stability and all of those things. The short hair was a sign that you were an honorable, respectful man. But if you had long hair, they considered that a symbol of rebellion, that you were rebelling against the social order, you were rebelling against society, you were rebelling against the very foundations that the world operated on. At the same time, long hair was considered honorable for women. If you had long hair as a woman, they took that to mean you were embracing your womanhood, that you were an honorable, respectful woman. You respected the social order, you respected society and the structures of society and so on and so forth. You respected your place in your function and your role in society. But if you had short hair, they took that once again as a sign of rebellion. They took that as a sign that you were rebelling against the social order, that you were rejecting the social order, that you were not honorable, you were not trustworthy, you were not respectable or respectful towards society and civilization itself. They saw those things as active rebellions against civilization. And so the only women who had short hair were either adulteresses who had their hair shaved off as a punishment. It was meant to show everyone, basically tell the world, this is an adulteress. Do not respect her. Do not honor her. Do not trust her. Or prostitutes, once again, in the same way. Prostitutes in the pagan world, not the Jewish world, but in the pagan world, prostitutes often had shaved heads to signify that they were prostitutes so that the Roman men could recognize prostitutes when they were out and about in case they wanted to go and take advantage of one. But they gave zero honor to prostitutes. They thought they had zero value, zero dignity, zero worth. They didn't see them as humans. They saw them as objects. They saw them as human blow-up dolls. That's how they saw prostitutes. And so if you were a woman with short hair, it either would have been interpreted by the people around you in the Roman Empire to mean, A, you are an adulteress. You have no respect for the marital bond and contract and so on and so forth. You're unfaithful to your husband, or that you are a prostitute, so you're an object to be pushed around and used for gratification, or just that you have no respect for society, civilization, the social order. And at exactly the same time, in the ancient Roman world, they believed that women needed to wear head coverings when they were out and about in public. Having a head covering was an image of modesty and marital faithfulness and honor and respect. Again, it's a sign that you respect the social order. If you did not wear a head covering out and about, it was almost always a sign of rebellion. The only exceptions to that were that, one, prostitutes were not allowed to wear head coverings, and two, pagan priestesses did not wear head coverings. Now, the reason pagan priestesses didn't wear head coverings is because pagan priestesses were also prostitutes. We shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that pagan priestesses were authority figures. They were actually not authority figures in ancient Roman paganism most of the time. In ancient Roman paganism, the pagan priestess, the female priest in the pagan temple, was, you would go there and she would help you perform some kind of ritual in honor of the pagan god or the pagan goddess, and then she had to have sex with you as part of a kind of pagan sex ritual. It was a ritual act of sex. And once again, pagan priestesses, like all other prostitutes, did not have the right to say no to your sexual advance. So when you had sex with the pagan priestess prostitute, it was typically rape, not consensual sex. Those were the only types of women who did not wear head coverings in the ancient Roman world. And so long hair for women and head coverings was a symbol that you respect the social order, civilization, societal structures, that you respect marital faithfulness and honor and dignity and worth and value and all of these things. And for men, short hair signified all the same things, and at exactly the same time. And kind of the basis of all of this is that they saw long hair as a visible representation of femininity, femaleness, and they saw short hair as a representation of masculinity, maleness. These were basic gender distinctions, and these were how they were reflected in the societal order at the time. Now, there's nothing permanent or magic or eternal about long hair or head coverings. If you are a woman with short hair today, that does not mean that you are rejecting your femininity or that you are rejecting, gender distinctions. If you're a woman who doesn't wear head coverings today, which is most women, then that does not mean that you are rejecting your femininity or that you are rejecting gender distinctions. Plenty of extremely feminine women have short hair. Plenty of extremely masculine women have long hair, right? In the same way, being a tomboy is not rejecting your femininity or anything like that. Maleness and femaleness is a universal part of God's created order. Maleness and femaleness, masculinity and femininity, these are universal aspects of God's created design for the world. But every culture throughout all of time has expressed masculinity just a little bit differently and expressed femininity just a little bit differently. So there's masculine men with long hair. There are feminine women with short hair. There are masculine men who don't really work out. There are feminine women who are bodybuilder types. There are masculine men who don't really build things. There are feminine women who are full on, handy women, and so on and so forth. The expressions of masculinity and femininity are culturally relative, I guess you could say, but the reality that there is a difference between men and women. There are some biological differences between men and women. That is an eternal reality. And yet the Corinthian Christians had taken something true that Paul said, but they had distorted it into something that is not true. They took something true. What Paul said was, men and women are equal in Christ's kingdom. Men and women have equal value, equal worth in Christ's kingdom. Men are not above women. Women are not below men. Men and women, just like in marriage, like we talked about last week, men and women are mutual. They are equal. They are on level ground. One is not subordinate to the other. They took that truth and they took it past what Paul actually said and taught. They said, okay, so if we're all equal, if there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, rich or poor in Christ, then gender distinctions don't matter. Women can just act like men, and men can just act like women. Women can just be with other women. Men can just be with other men. We can erase the distinctions and the roles that men and women play, but those distinctions are baked into our nature. Those roles are baked into our nature. Men are biologically wired to be more suited towards certain things, and women are biologically wired to be more suited towards other certain things. Now, it's not hard and fast. It's not rigid. We're going to see that in a little bit, right? We know for a fact, both from here in 1 Corinthians 11 and the rest of the New Testament, Paul actively tells women, hey, you should prophesy in your worship services. Prophesying means delivering a word from the Lord. Prophesying is basically indistinguishable from preaching or teaching. It is delivering the word of the Lord, the message of the Lord. Prophesying is a form of teaching. It is a form of preaching. Paul says, women, when you prophesy, you should cover your heads. That means two things. One, it means they should cover their heads when they're prophesying. Two, it means they should prophesy. That is a form of leadership. That is a form of authority. Paul does not teach 1950s Eisenhower era gender roles. He does not teach traditional gender roles. He says, women, you should prophesy. He says, women, you should lead prayer. We know Phoebe was a deacon at the church in Centuria. That is a leadership position. That is an administrative position. He says you should hold these leadership positions. In Romans 16, he talks about Junia. She was an apostle. That means she was a church planter and missionary. That means just like Paul, she would go to places where there were no Christians, were no churches. She would convert people, disciple people, and then plant a church where she would teach and lead the people, and then eventually raise up new leadership. That is a form of authority. When Paul sent the letter to the Romans, he sent it with Phoebe as not only the courier, but her job also would have been to stick around for months and months and months to teach them what every aspect, every verse of the book of Romans means. She was basically expository preaching her way through the book of Romans the same way that I do through books of the Bible on Sunday mornings. So Paul is actively sending women out to preach and teach, administrate, be deacons, lead, plant churches, make disciples. There are very few leadership positions within the church that we don't actively see women holding in the New Testament. So Paul is not teaching traditional gender roles here. And yet the Corinthians took that and they distorted it and said, okay, there's no need for gender distinction. So some of the women started shaving their heads, wearing short hair. Some of them stopped wearing head coverings during worship. Some of the men started growing their hair out long. To compound this, we know that a very large portion of the earliest churches consisted of former prostitutes. And so the churches were filled with women who were not allowed to cover their hair and who were not allowed to grow their hair long. And as a result, the pagans in Corinth, looking in at the Corinthian Christians from the outside, would have been unbelievably confused. They looked in at them and they thought, these Corinthians, they don't respect the very foundations of society. They don't even respect the distinction between men and women. And as a result, no one would listen to anything they said. They thought that the Corinthians were just a bunch of wild, lecherous, untrustworthy, insane extremists who should be avoided at all costs, along with the gods that they worship. They said, whatever God these Corinthians are worshiping, we want no part of him. And that actively sabotaged the mission that God sent the Corinthian Christians on in Corinth. And so Paul comes in to correct the Corinthians, and he does it in a very specific way. He says, listen, gender distinctions are good and right and holy. They are part of God's good created design, and I'll prove it to you. He says, because of the angels, women should cover their hair in the service. What does that mean? He's saying, when we worship, we are joining in the worship that is happening with all the rest of creation and in the heavenly places. We are worshiping along with the entire rest of the created order, alongside the angels and everyone in heaven. And so our worship should reflect the good created order that God created and designed our world with. Our worship should reflect the good gender distinctions and gender roles that God built into the world when He created it. What is that created order? He says the created order is that God created men and women to be complementary, not competing. He created them to be complementary, not interchangeable. He created men and women to be interdependent. Men are not independent from women. Women are not independent from men. Men need women. Women need men. He says, I'll prove it to you. He says men are the source or head. The word he's using is the Greek word kephale. The word kephale very, very rarely means head as in authority, but almost always means source, not authority. He says, men are the source of women in the sense that Adam was created first, and then women were created out of Adam. Eve was created out of Adam. He says, woman is the glory of man, just like man is the glory of God. When God created Adam, Adam reflected God, and then God created Eve out of Adam's side, not out of his rib. That is not the right way to translate that. He literally says God took Eve out of his side. Essentially, God split Adam in half. And so Adam changed, and Eve came into being. When God split Adam in half to create Eve, to create woman, what happened was Adam received the masculine aspects of humanity. Eve received the feminine aspects of humanity. And as a result, neither is complete without the other. He says, man is the original source of woman, but now women give birth to men. So now women are the source of men. So woman could not have come into being without man, but now man cannot come into being without women. Men and women are dependent on each other. And as a result, we are complementary to each other. You need masculinity and you need femininity. You need what both men and women bring to the table in order to image God's glory in its fullness. And so Paul says, listen, in your gathered worship services, women need to express the gender distinction of femininity. They need to have long hair, and they need to have their hair covered. When they do this, they are affirming God's good, created design of men and women. And men need to have short hair and have their heads uncovered to affirm God's good, created design. That there are men and women, and they are not the same. You need to embrace the reality of gender roles. That was problem number 4. Here's problem number 5. He says, you've been turning the Lord's Supper into a class war. You've been distorting the purpose of the Lord's Supper by turning it into a competition, into a class war between the rich Christians in the Corinthian church and the poor Christians in the Corinthian church. What is he talking about? To understand what he's talking about, you need to understand that in the early church, the Lord's Supper was not this weird little crackers and grape juice thing we do. We have like a tiny little wafer and a shot of grape juice that you throw back. That is not how the Lord's Supper worked in the early church. No, in the early church, the Lord's Supper was a full meal. It was a full feast. It was a potluck, and they did it every single week. They worshiped the Lord by singing hymns to him. They worshiped the Lord by studying his word together through sermons, teaching, prophecy, and so on and so forth. They worshiped the Lord through fellowship together, and they worshiped the Lord through what they called the breaking of bread, through communion, through the Lord's Supper. They would have a potluck every single week after the service, as part of the service. And when they did that potluck feast, they were reenacting the Last Supper where Jesus broke the bread and shared the wine. And he said, this bread is like my body that is going to be broken for you. This wine is like my blood that's going to be poured out for you. I am going to redeem you and restore you and adopt you into my family and my kingdom and my covenant, and you are going to be my people. He says, this is the blood of my new covenant. And so now, because of the cross, we are one people, one family, one kingdom, one covenant. And he has knit us together, and we glorify him through this togetherness, this unity, this mutual encouragement and support and reinforcement and so forth. And so at this potluck, if you were a poor Christian, you may not have any food to bring, but you would be well fed by the excess food brought by the others. And this was a symbol and an image of the fact that you are one body, one people, one family, one kingdom, one covenant. They would symbolize this with the fact that they would have one giant loaf of bread that they would all take the bread from. It was a beautiful image. And yet the Corinthians were distorting this beautiful image, because the rich Corinthians would bring an absolute feast's worth of food, and they would refuse to share it with the poor. They were once again pridefully exalting themselves, pridefully puffing themselves up. They were exercising a superiority complex. They were actively pushing the poor Corinthian Christians into a position of being beneath them. They were imaging their perceived superiority in the fact that we have a feast's worth of food, more food than we need, and you have nothing. They were treating the Lord's Supper like a class war. Jesus says this literally makes a mockery of the meaning of the Lord's Supper, and it makes a mockery of the cross that has turned you into one people. He says, when you do that, you are eating the supper unworthily. And so he says, you need to examine yourselves. Ask yourselves, why are you doing this? Why are you treating your brothers and sisters in God's family, your fellow citizens in God's kingdom, your fellow covenant people, this way? That was problem number 2. That was the second way they had turned their worship into something self-centered instead of God-centered. Now, the third way that the Corinthians had turned their worship services into something that was self-centered and man-centered rather than God-centered was that they even turned spiritual gifts into a competition. Now, in order to understand this, we need to understand a handful of things. We have to understand that God has given us unique gifts. We're not just talking about talents that we have, like you're pretty good at music, you're pretty good at administration, and so on and so forth. He's talking very specifically about the way that the Holy Spirit has descended onto us, just like Paul was talking about at the beginning of the letter to the Corinthians. We talked about it last week, but the Spirit has descended on us. The Spirit dwells within us. So now God's own presence is with us and in us at all times, leading us and guiding us and empowering us. Spiritual gifts are specific ways that the Spirit has empowered each of us. And so I may have certain spiritual gifts. You may have different spiritual gifts. That person over there may have a totally different set of spiritual gifts than both you and me, and so on and so forth. But these are just specific and unique ways that each of us have been specially gifted by the Spirit. And the reason that we have been specially gifted by the Spirit is, number one, for the mission that God has given us. Each of the spiritual gifts that the Lord gives to each of us is meant to demonstrate the reality of Jesus, the truth of King Jesus, that Jesus really is the King over all things that we have been looking for and waiting for, so that when non-believers, when non-Christians, when people who reject or resist or run from or oppose King Jesus and the truth of the gospel see us carrying out his work, using these unique, divine, supernatural giftings that the Spirit has given to us, it actively verifies the message that we are giving. Now sometimes it's really obvious and unmistakable things, like the gift of miraculous healings, or the gift of being able to communicate with people who speak different languages that we do not speak, that we do not know, and so on and so forth. Sometimes it's miraculous giftings like those, but other times it's much more mundane. Paul lists off a whole bunch of different gifts. I'm not going to list them all off exhaustively, because when he lists off the gifts, he's not trying to teach them about what each gift is. He's literally just using them as an example. He's like, well, you know that there are people who are apostles and teachers and shepherds and so on and so forth, prophets. You know that there are people who are gifted with hospitality, people who are gifted with prophecy, who are gifted with all this other stuff. He's literally just saying, you know, there's all these different types of gifts. He's not trying to explain what each one is. That wouldn't be the point that he is making here. The point he's making is, God has given you all these wonderful spiritual gifts, but the reason he's given them to you is, number one, to empower you to carry out his kingdom mission, his redemptive mission, to reach the lost and the hurting and the broken and the struggling there in Corinth with the message of the God who wants to redeem and restore them. That is why he's given you these gifts. And number two, he's given you the gifts that he's given you in order to build up the rest of the body, to build up your brothers and sisters in the faith, to build up the rest of the kingdom workers in the kingdom communities in Corinth called the church. So these spiritual gifts are meant to empower and enable us to bring people to the truth, and once they have come to the truth and have become our brothers and our sisters and our fellow covenant people and our fellow kingdom workers on mission with King Jesus, then the gifts now serve a second function, a double function, which is building them up, encouraging them, supporting them, helping them, strengthening them. These are the purposes that God gave us these spiritual gifts for. They exist for no other reason than that. And yet the Corinthians have taken these good spiritual gifts God has given them, like the gift of prophecy, like the gift of visions, like the gift of angelic tongues, like all these other gifts. These are wonderful gifts to have. These are beautiful gifts to have. If you have the gift of tongues, that is awesome and you should use it. If you have the gift of prophecy, that is awesome and you should use it. If you have the gift of healing, that is awesome and you should use it, and on and on and on. But what's happened in the churches in Corinth is that they've actually turned these gifts, just like everything else, into a way of exalting themselves over others, glorifying themselves over others. They have turned these into tools to feed and build up their superiority complex over others. They want power and prestige and status. And so they've begun seeking status through the gift of tongues. They've begun seeking status through the gift of prophecy, seeking status through the gift of visions, through the gift of healing, and so on and so forth. And that makes a mockery of these gifts, and it makes a mockery of the Spirit who has given them these gifts. They're actively trying to show off their spiritual gifts again and again and again. So every time they get together in their worship gatherings, they are actively trampling over each other, stepping on each other. They are actively interrupting each other. One person will be prophesying, and another person who also has the gift of prophecy will literally just interrupt them, butt in, and start prophesying something completely unrelated. One person will be, speaking in angelic tongues while someone else is trying to interpret it for the rest of the people. And then another person will just start speaking in angelic tongues too about something totally different. And there won't be someone there to interpret what this other person is doing. They're literally, it's like there's dueling prophecies, dueling tongue speakers, dueling whatever it is, what have you. It's ridiculous. They've begun to compete with each other, using their spiritual gifts to glorify themselves. But Paul says that is not what these gifts are for. You are abusing and misusing these gifts. He says, instead, you need to look at your gifts very differently. You need to start looking at your gifts as avenues to serve each other and to serve the lost by revealing the truth to them through your gifts. And number 4, the fourth way that they have turned their worship services into something self-centered instead of God-centered is that they have created this weird, chaotic service that is alienating to seekers. Now, this is going to get kind of interesting because there is a movement within the modern American church called the seeker-sensitive movement. Some people love the seeker-sensitive movement. Some people hate the seeker-sensitive movement. It was founded by churches like Saddleback Church in California, Willow Creek Church in Illinois, and a handful of others. Basically, the idea is that you want to remove anything that is in your church that is not part of the gospel, that is not part of God's commands, that is not part of God's calling on us. So you don't want to remove something God has literally told us to do. You don't want to change the doctrine. You don't change the gospel. You don't do away with God's good commands or anything like that. But you want to get rid of anything that is not commanded by God or required or encouraged by God that could potentially be an unnecessary barrier to people who are unbelievers but are open to Christianity. They call those seekers. If you are someone who is seeking the truth, who is seeking, God, you're saying, who is the real God? Who is the actual creator? Who is the actual, creator, designer, moral lawgiver, ruler over this world who we need to worship? Like, if you are seeking the truth about life, the universe, and everything, they call you a seeker. You are someone who is open to the truth, even if you are not a believer at this particular time. They say we want to remove anything that would unnecessarily push seekers away. That means you have to still preach and teach everything in Scripture, but you will probably change the way your church looks so that it looks relatively hip, or at least not embarrassing or tacky, right? You will change the style of music. You will stop singing songs from the 1970s that sound like you want to go to prom with Jesus and nibble on his ear in the backseat of your car. Like, I don't mean to be insulting here, but so much mid-20th century Christian music sounds extremely gay. If you are a man, you do not want to sing these songs. And if you walk into a church and you're singing these 1970s hyper tacky Phillips, Craig, and Dean songs about going on a date with Jesus, you were going to turn around, walk out, and never come back, right? That is a barrier that stands in the way of a lot of at least male seekers, or at least somewhat masculine seekers. I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to be like Archie Bunker here about this, but it's a legitimate thing. That is one reason why men avoid church like the plague, because the entire environment and culture walking into most churches is just so aggressively feminine that it is deeply uncomfortable to be there. It's not even that we want the church to look and feel masculine. We literally just want it to look and feel neutral. We want it to not feel like we're walking into a beauty shop and getting, Pulp Fiction style syringed in the chest with progesterone or something like that. But anyways, all of that is to say, basically, the idea behind the seeker-sensitive movement is that you want to remove anything that would unnecessarily or needlessly push seekers away. So you do not change the faith, you do not change the scriptures, you do not soften your preaching, but you try to find ways to communicate the truth of God's word in ways that will resonate well with seekers, with non-Christians. You try to communicate the scriptures in a way that makes sense to people who have no background with Christianity. That's the seeker-sensitive movement. Now, a lot of people have condemned the seeker-sensitive movement. People like John MacArthur, who just passed away. He's another pastor in California. He's kind of the opposite of a seeker-sensitive pastor. He said that the seeker-sensitive movement is a betrayal of the gospel and so on and so forth. A whole lot of others have said similar things like that. But I think that the book of 1 Corinthians puts Paul pretty squarely in the seeker-sensitive category, because he basically says, you have made your worship services unbelievably alienating and unpleasant for pagans walking in who are considering the gospel but haven't made the plunge yet. They are going to walk into your church, and what are they going to see? You've got this weird service, this chaotic service. There is no order to the service. One person starts prophesying, and then another person interrupts them and jumps in so they can be the one in the spotlight prophesying. One person is preaching or teaching, and someone else jumps in and interrupts them and starts literally preaching and teaching a different lesson, a different message, a different sermon. It's insane. You'll be in the middle of worship, and someone will just suddenly start speaking in angelic tongues, and there's no one around to interpret interpret what they're saying. So, they're having a good time because it's enjoyable to speak in tongues, but nobody else is having a good time. Everybody else is just uncomfortable and confused. He says, look, there is no value whatsoever in speaking in tongues in the service unless there is someone to interpret it for everybody else. If there's no one around to interpret it, then it's something you just need to do on your own, alone, at home. It's there to edify you, but it's not there to edify everybody else. And at the same time, he says just there's this fundamental chaos in your services because everyone is trying to butt in and one-up each other with their gifts and everything else, because the women refuse to wear head coverings, refuse to grow their hair out as comes naturally to women, because the men refuse to cut their hair down to a short length that represents masculinity in this culture because of all these different things. If I were a pagan from Corinth who was considering the message of Jesus and I came into your churches, I would turn around and walk out and I would never come back again, because you've made it so weird, so chaotic, so alienating for seekers. Your services are not sensitive to seekers. They are not comprehensible to seekers. You need to make your services reasonably orderly, smooth, and palatable to people who are not Christians yet, who are visiting to consider the message of Jesus. And so he gives several specific instructions. He says, look, one or two people, maybe three, should prophesy, and you need to take turns, okay? One or two people, maybe three, absolute max, should get up to teach. And again, you need to freaking take turns. Do not speak in tongues unless there is someone there who has the gift of interpretation, who can interpret the message that you are speaking in those angelic tongues. If there's not someone there, then you just need to wait and do it at home. And in the same way, he says, specifically, the women in the church need to not disrupt the service. Now, what I'm about to say is something you need to write in pencil, not in Sharpie. Here's why. When Paul says the women need to be silent in church, we don't know for sure what Paul is trying to say. Why do I say that? It's because of a couple of things. Number one, we know for a fact Paul is literally not saying women should not speak in church. We know that because Paul, 3 chapters earlier, straight up told the women to speak in church. He told them to prophesy in church with their heads covered. If you are prophesying in church, then you are speaking in church. He told the women to lead prayer in church. Again, you cannot lead prayer without speaking in church. So, you don't have to be a genius to know. He is not saying women should be silent in church. He is not saying women should not speak in church. And he wouldn't be saying that because, again, like I said before, he sent Phoebe to expositorily preach through his letter to the Romans to the churches in Rome. That is a form of speaking in church. He sent Junia out as an apostle, a missionary, a church planter to convert people to Christianity, disciple them, raise them up into maturity in the faith, and literally build a network of churches in places where there are none. You literally cannot do that without speaking in church. So, one thing we know for absolute certain, Paul is not telling women not to speak in church. It is that simple. That is reason number one. Here's reason number two. We don't actually know whether this verse is meant to be in this chapter. So, why do I say that? one thing that is very frequently pointed out by textual scholars. These are specifically biblical scholars who deal with comparing the 24,000 ancient manuscripts of the biblical texts to each other. When they compare these 24,000 ancient biblical texts to each other, what they find is in the earliest copies of 1 Corinthians that we have, this verse where Paul says the women should not speak in church is not in those manuscripts. You look at the earliest manuscripts we have of 1 Corinthians, and some of them have this verse where Paul says the women should be silent in church, just ask your husbands at home, and some of the manuscripts do not have this verse. That is compounded by the fact that literally, open up your Bible right now, go to 1 Corinthians 14, look at the paragraph where this verse is found. Now, put your finger over the verse and read everything that comes before the verse and everything that comes after the verse, but skip over this verse. What do you notice? You notice that Paul's argument works perfectly when you cover up that verse and pretend it's not there. But then when you pull your finger back and you look at the paragraph once again with the verse there and you read it with that there, Paul is talking about this thing over here. He's talking about prophesying. He's talking about speaking in tongues. He's talking about having someone to interpret. He's talking about waiting your turn before you teach and preach. He's talking about not weirding out the pagans who come and visit the service. And then suddenly he says, by the way, women, don't speak. Just ask your husbands at home. And then he goes right back to talking about prophesying and speaking in tongues and waiting your turn and not freaking out the pagans. It's like, wait, why did you suddenly jump over to talk about this and then jump right back? The verse fits very weirdly in the paragraph. And so when you take the fact that this verse is literally not in a lot of the earliest manuscripts of 1 Corinthians 14, and the fact that it doesn't fit very snugly in the argument that Paul is making there in that paragraph, a lot of scholars believe that most likely at some point what happened was someone wrote a note in the margin there in 1 Corinthians 14. Someone later down the line wrote a note in the margin that said, no, women should not speak in church. They should not prophesy. They should not speak in tongues. They should not lead the prayers. They should not, any of those things. That maybe they wrote it in the margins basically as a way of saying, in our church, the women will not be speaking. They will be silent. They will ask their husbands questions at home and stuff like that. And then as that manuscript was copied, maybe that marginal note just kind of accidentally found its way into the paragraph where it didn't belong. So that is one common theory among scholars, but I'm gonna say you should be very, very cautious taking up theories like that. So I've laid out that theory for you, and I've explained it. And I always want to, I never want to straw man, an argument or a theory that somebody makes. You want to do what's called steel manning. So straw manning means that you present an argument in the weakest possible way. Steel manning means that you present an argument in the strongest possible way. So I want to steel man other people's arguments. A lot of other people, a lot of biblical scholars argue that probably that verse was not originally found in 1 Corinthians 14, that Paul didn't write that. Probably someone wrote it as like a marginal note on the manuscript copy that they had, and then eventually that manuscript copy, that marginal note just ended up in the text the next time it was copied, which was then copied again, which was then copied again, and so on and so forth, until eventually, for one reason or another, the copy of 1 Corinthians that had that marginal note accidentally inserted into the text became one of the most common manuscript traditions, but then if you look at the earliest ones, it's often actually not found there. So that is the argument that a lot of scholars make. I would hesitate to adopt that argument, because I think if you're going to argue that a verse is literally not actually in the text, you need to be really, really, really sure. And when we look at the earliest manuscripts we have of 1 Corinthians, that verse is found in some of them and it is not found in others. The fact that it is found in some of them suggests to me it is probably part of the original letter that Paul wrote. So I think we need to deal with that sentence. I think we need to treat that sentence like Paul wrote it. I think we need to figure out what Paul would have meant if he had written that. So what might Paul have meant? Well, look at the broader context of 1 Corinthians 14. Look at the broader context of the argument he's making. The argument that he is making is your services are jacked up because they're super weird, super chaotic, and super alienating. He's talking about everybody talking over each other throughout the service, jumping into speaking in tongues with nobody there to interpret it, interrupting other people's messages and teachings and sermons to start their own messages and teachings and sermons, interrupting other people's prophecies to start their own prophecies. They're literally just, there's this chaotic, they're interrupting each other. They are disrupting the service. They are derailing the service. So when Paul brings this up and he says, hey, women, be silent, ask your husbands at home, don't speak. We know he's not saying that they should literally never speak in church. What is he probably saying? He's probably saying that in some way, a lot of the women in the Corinthian church have been behaving disruptively during the service. In some way, they've been interrupting the service. In some way, they've been derailing the service by talking. So the issue here is not women shouldn't talk because women should be silent. Women should be seen and not heard. That's clearly not what Paul is saying. Most likely what he's saying is many of the women in the Corinthian churches have developed this pattern of speaking disruptively. He's saying, women, stop speaking disruptively in the service. You should speak in ways that contribute. You should not speak in ways that are disruptive. What could possibly be disruptive about what some of the women in the Corinthian churches have been doing? There's a number of theories, but the one that I think makes the most sense is this. One of the things that we know from history about the ancient Roman Empire is that during this time period, both in the Jewish synagogues and in most of the pagan temples and so on and so forth, in worship services, both among the ancient Jews and among the ancient pagans, most of the time they were gender segregated, meaning that the men sat on one side of the room and the women sat on another side of the room. So there was a men's section and a women's section often. Actually, in some places today throughout the world, in some places in the Middle East and so on and so forth, they actually still do that in a lot of the churches. The men will sit on the men's side and the women will sit on the women's side. Even here in America, in some Mennonite churches and stuff like that, they will have men's sides and women's sides. They're carrying over an old cultural tradition from a time where they saw things very differently. But so frequently we know that in Jewish synagogues and in pagan temples they would have men's sides and women's sides. We don't know for sure if the early churches kept that practice or not. So that's why I'm saying write this in pencil, not Sharpie. What I'm saying, this is a plausible reconstruction of what this could mean. This is not some kind of certain answer about what it must mean. So, this is me giving a hypothesis. This is a common hypothesis. This is not something I came up with. This is a common hypothesis among both historians and biblical scholars. But essentially, if the churches in Corinth had a men's section and women's section, were kind of gender segregated the way that most things were at that point in time, then the women would be over in their own section of the room. Now it's a small room. but they'd be over in their own section. Now, at the same time, we know that at this point in time in history, in the Roman Empire, women were typically not educated anywhere near to the extent that men were. Very frequently, women were given very little education because that was not seen as part of a woman's role. The advent of Christianity actually changed that. With the coming of Christianity, with each passing century, women were given more and more and more legal rights. Why? Because the gospel has broken down the arbitrary barrier between men and women. The gospel has broken down the hierarchy between men and women, the subordination of women and the domination of men. The gospel has broken down that fallen and broken way of living. And so the Christianization of the Roman Empire through the years actually afforded women more and more and more rights. But at this point in time, it's the first century. That's still not the case. So women were typically not educated. Most cities, such as Corinth, would have been multilingual. Why does that matter? It matters because very frequently what that means is that the often uneducated women would not have spoken the language that was being used in some of the teachings and preachings and prophesyings and interpretations during the church services in Corinth. Therefore, what? Therefore, often there may have been a whole bunch of women sitting over in their own section of the church who literally couldn't understand what was being preached or taught or prophesied or interpreted. So they were just bored, and they would have started talking among themselves. Maybe the ones who didn't speak the language would have been continually asking the women who did speak the language of the preacher or the teacher or the prophet or the interpreter, saying, hey, what's he saying? Okay, now what's he saying? Okay, now what's going on? Okay, now what's going on? At full volume, kind of like, I've got a lot of friends who I cannot take to a movie theater because they will not stop talking at full volume in the movie theater. Same kind of thing, right? And so it's very possible, even likely, that if they had a gender segregated church, which we don't know, and if a lot of the women in the Corinthian churches didn't speak the language that was sometimes used by some of the preachers or teachers or prophets or interpreters, then it's possible that they were just full volume talking among themselves, asking questions to the women who did speak the language, and flat out disrupting and derailing the service, in which case Paul says, hey, look, okay, listen, stop. Just stop talking during the service. Just wait until you get home and ask your husband what the preacher or the teacher or the prophet or the interpreter was saying. And so if that is the case, most likely what's happening here is Paul is once again saying, hey, stop being disruptive and derailing the service. In the same way he said, hey, stop prophesying over each other. Hey, stop jumping in and interrupting each other with your prophecies and your tongues and your interpretations and your messages and so on and so forth. But whatever the case, however we end up interpreting this one verse from 1 Corinthians 14, the point Paul is making is clear. The worship service needs to be orderly and simple and smooth. Why? For the sake of the pagan seekers who are visiting your churches, considering the message of Jesus. We finally finished problem number 5, that their worship gatherings have become self-centered, not God-centered. And finally, we need to get to problem number 6 that makes up the rest of the letter. And that is that the Corinthian Christians had fallen into a misconception, a false teaching. They had begun to deny the resurrection of Jesus and the value of the human body, the value of the material world, the value of the physical world. And this is important. This is at the root of all the other problems that Paul lists here in 1 Corinthians. These Corinthian Christians, they have grown up in ancient paganism. And in ancient paganism, they believed, like I said before, that the human body has no value, that the material world has no value, that the physical world has no value. They thought your soul mattered, but your body was worthless. They thought your mind, your intellect mattered, but that your body was worthless, that the physical world was worthless. They believed that the spiritual world was good, but the physical world was bad. And therefore, they believed that the only important things in life are going and making prayers to the gods, making sacrifices to the gods, paying your devotion and your homage to the gods, doing philosophy and meditating and learning and stuff like that. But they didn't think that it mattered how you treated other people. They didn't think that it mattered how you treated your wife. They didn't think it mattered who you had sex with. They didn't think it mattered how you ran your business, whether you were trustworthy or corrupt, whether you were just or unjust, and so on and so forth. It was okay to treat people like objects. It was okay to oppress people. It was okay to abuse people, so long as you did your religious devotion and you read philosophy and stuff like that. And the Corinthian Christians would have carried that mindset into their faith. And as a result, they've got all these different problems, right? They tolerate and celebrate rampant sin, oppression, injustice within their church. Because they believe if the body doesn't matter, if the physical world doesn't matter, if the material world doesn't matter, if life in this world doesn't matter, if all that matters is the spiritual world, the world beyond, and we can do whatever we want and it doesn't make any difference. But Paul says that is not true. Paul says God cares about your body. God cares about the physical world. God cares about the material world. And God cares what you do with your body, what you do in this material and physical world, what you do in this life, in this world. Your behavior, your actions matter. And he says, I will prove it to you. He says, we know God cares about all of these things because, number one, God has promised to renew all things, including the physical material world, including our bodies, in the end when he returns and restores everything, undoes the fall, unbreaks the world, puts everything right again. He's not nuking this world and taking us all off to some spiritual plane. No, he is renewing and restoring this world in the end. Number two, we know he cares about all these things because God has promised to raise up our bodies and restore our bodies in the end. He doesn't just take our souls up to heaven in the magic school bus. He raises our bodies up, puts our souls and our bodies back together and renews them. And he says, we know this for a fact. He has proven this because he came down from heaven, took on a human body. If God took on a human body, that means human bodies are good. He lived in the physical world. If God lived in the physical world, that means the physical world is good. And then when he died on the cross, he rose up from the grave. He bodily rose. He rose his body up from the grave on the third day with hundreds of witnesses. We know it really happened. And if it really happened, that means that the body is good. And that means that the physical and material world is good. And that means that it matters what we do with our bodies in this physical material world. How we behave, how we live, our actions do matter. Therefore, you need to stop having sex with your stepmom. You need to stop visiting prostitutes. You need to stop using lawsuits to enrich yourself and oppress poorer believers. You need to stop pushing people around when it comes to meat sacrificed to idols. You need to stop making your worship gatherings self-centered rather than God-centered. You need to stop turning spiritual gifts into a competition. You need to stop blurring the lines between men and women and rejecting gender distinctions. You need to stop turning the Lord's Supper into a class war, rich versus poor and slave versus free, and so on and so forth. You need to stop fighting over who gets to be in charge of what, who gets to preach, who gets to prophesy, who gets to speak in tongues, who gets to interpret, who gets to do this and that and this and that. You need to stop all of these things. Because your behavior in this world, in this body, matters. And at the same time, he says, because human bodies matter, physical needs matter, you need to collect your money and you need to send it to the famine victims in Jerusalem to help ease their suffering. And finally, because all these things matter, you need to do what you can to help meet the bodily, physical, material needs of not only myself, Paul, but also the rest of my partners in the gospel, the rest of my kingdom workers like Timothy and Apollos and Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus and Aquila and Priscilla and so many others. This is how you live as God's set apart kingdom people on mission with Jesus in Corinth. You have been living in a way that is very much not set apart, that is wicked and worldly. And as a result, your witness has been compromised and sabotaged in Corinth. But if you begin to live like God's set apart kingdom people on mission in Corinth, then the pagans around you will see you, be amazed at your witness, and be drawn to the truth through you. That is 1 Corinthians. Let me know, what questions do you have about 1 Corinthians? What are some things that confuse you? What are some things you need more information about? You need explained in greater detail? Put your questions in the comments in the Facebook group for Let's Read Scripture Together, or in the comments of this YouTube video, and I will tackle them as soon as I get the chance between now and then. I love you guys. Take care and keep reading.